Oh, this is hilarious. That was crazy. I was like, because that's the world being like, hello, I'm Shoki. Okay, so let me get hello and welcome to a new episode of Africa as a Country Talk. I'm Sean Jacobs. See how quickly I got serious there. Streaming from Brooklyn, New York. Very humid, very hot. My co-host is William Shoki. He is in Johannesburg, South Africa. Africa as a Country Talk, or AIAC Talk, is a weekly talk and interview show. We broadcast every Tuesday at 7 p.m. East African time, 5 p.m. in Dakar, and 6 p.m. in Johannesburg. And by the way, I saw that photo from Dakar with Florian Boven, who was on the program, I think like 2 weeks ago, hanging out with Sadio Mane.
What? No way. Send it to me.
I was like, what? Yeah, that was a little too much for me to start my day. It was beautiful, but I was like, damn, I would like to hang out with Sadio Mane, the greatest African football player of his generation. Our show is produced, as always, by Antoinette Engel, who is in Cape Town, South Africa.
And you're watching episode 43 at the moment. And in a few moments, we're going to be chatting to returning guest Grieve Chelwa about the life and legacy of Zambia's founding president, Mzee Kenneth Kaunda, who passed away last week. And then we're also going to be talking to Herman Wasserman about the rise of misinformation in society, what conditions are giving rise to it, who's spreading it, and how do we combat it. If you missed last week's show, we were joined by Anakwa Dwamina and Bhakti Sringapure to discuss books and publishing in Africa. We spoke about the industry in general, but also about the political possibilities that come with having a thriving reading and literary culture. That episode, if you've missed it, is now on our YouTube channel. But as always, subscribe to our Patreon for all of the episodes from our archive and to support our work more generally. But before we start the program, we're going to talk to Grieve about Mzee Kaunda in a moment, and then we're going to talk about the media and its credibility with Herman. But you know, the way Kaunda's passing was covered in the mainstream press actually sort of brought a lot of these issues together, Sean, just some of the coverage of Kaunda.
More like just how somebody, I think on Twitter, said we should decolonize obituaries. And I'd like to hear from Grieve about from Grieve, we want to hear about how Zambians remember Kaunda's legacy, how Africans remember him. Because what we get is when somebody like Kaunda dies, you have a lot of us run to like the New York Times, the Guardian, maybe the Financial Times, which a lot of people kind of swear by. But what was interesting about their obituaries was they ran in the case of the Times, they had an obituary written by somebody who died in 2010. The person who wrote the obituary about Kaunda died in 2010. And then the person who wrote the obituary for The Guardian died in January last year. Now, people are saying that obituaries are written sometimes, like, you write them and you have them ready because it's like a famous person. But I'm assuming you have to kind of imagine that the way that you thought about Kaunda in 2010 is very different from how you, I think of Kaunda now, because Grieve can, in a couple of minutes, he could say something about this. So Zambia is now governed by this guy called Edgar Lungu, who is definitely was no Kaunda. So I don't know how you can write in 2010 and how you write now. But then the other one is the FT had its obituary written by Michael Holman, who is generally considered a pretty decent journalist. But in his obituary, the obituary was like, it was kind of petty in a way. I was like, what is up with this obituary? Making fun of Kaunda has like this kind of white handkerchief that he would wave. So he made like fun of that. He went on about how Kaunda was like sort of almost like it didn't matter what Kaunda's political stance was on U.S. foreign policy or on kind of all the proxy states, or proxy movements operating in Southern Africa for the apartheid state, or his contribution to the liberation of all these countries in the region. He was sort of like a paper tiger. But the worst thing was he ended the piece with a kind of anecdote about how Kaunda spoke at Mandela's funeral in 2013. And people remember this because we've tweeted this clip. it's Kaunda, like, I think he's 89 or something at that point, running on the stage. I'm literally jogging. If you see it, like he waits, and then when they give him his cue that it's his time to go onto the stage, he just like does like this little fast jog, and everybody applauds. And anyway, so according to Michael Holman, he then sang a song, which it's terrible that I'm forgetting the title now, because it's a famous kind of song associated with Kaunda. It's about liberation and, sort of associated with his political party. And he says Kaunda started to sing the song, and nobody knew the words, and this was an indication of how out of touch Kaunda and Mandela was with the world that they made. And you just like, hold up. I was like, I think Will sent me the like, Will's like, yo, bro, did you see this? I think that was what you probably implied. So I was like, let me go look at that video again. And there I saw the video. What does Kaunda do? He runs on the stage. It's obvious that there's a lot of warmth between him and the audience. They love, people love Kaunda. I mean, come on, this is Southern Africa. He then starts the song. Some people in the audience join in, and he jokingly says, oh, I think you guys have forgotten the words. Kind of like a joke about time and age and all that. And then he stops, and he continues with his speech, which has a lot of jokes in it, lots of references. But with some people, he referred to like the negotiations between the Afrikaners and the ANC. I mean, he went on. It was real funny and so on. And when he was done, he got a standing ovation. And I was like, what speech or event did Michael Holman write about? He obviously just made that up, as people would say, like cloth. Like, it never existed. I think we're showing
there it is.
The video now on the screen. I mean, there's, it was a little jog. And this whole thing, he gets applauded. So in any case, I mean, this is not so, there's a little bit of, I don't want to say Michael Holman committed fake news, because I don't want to do that. I'm just thinking he was trying to make a point, which I was also complaining on Twitter, that you would never see, Kaunda was never as terrible as Churchill, or the kind of war crimes and things that Reagan had made himself guilty of, the lying, the clandestine funding of all kinds of movements in whether it was in South America or whatever. The paragraph is right at the end of this piece that's scrolling up on our screen. But in any case, I think that this captured very well. And the last point about this is, somebody pointed out on Twitter, is that then the African publications would merely repeat this kind of journalism. So I think somebody tweeted at us, called Suntos Pile. I don't know him, but he has a very sharp Twitter presence. He pointed out, for example, that the Sunday Times in South Africa had their obituary written by own correspondent. And what did own correspondent do? Which is, I think it's like a sub-editor or something, or the night reporter. Basically just quoted from the New York Times, the Guardian, and the FT.
And it's funny, we were talking about this last week, we were thinking about the history of this publication, about how we want to move away from covering how the world covers Africa. But I guess this episode is testament to the fact that how the world covers Africa still lags behind, and it's still important, because literally, if you have a South African publication that's just parroting these foreign publications, then Africans are conceiving of themselves through this Western prism, which is bizarre. And like, I've seen the same thing, where a lot of these obituaries just sort of repeat those binaries, which are always regurgitated when everyone is assessing the legacy of a post-colonial African leader, where they say, well, they had good intentions, they wanted their people to not be poor anymore, but, they were authoritarian, and whenever democracy is compromised, then that completely tarnishes everything else that they wanted to do. So these extremely simple, uncomplicated narratives. And it's still very disappointing to see that this is the majority of coverage around the world. And of course, we're going to talk to Herman in a couple of minutes about the way a lot of professional media is losing credibility for precisely this reason. I mean, I can only imagine if this was in South Africa and a South African leader was spoken about this way, the way that would have caused such a fracas. But
On Twitter, yeah, no, definitely.
On Twitter,
definitely.
exactly.
I mean, this one other quick point on this is like, and I know hopefully Herman will say something about this, but there's also something, as somebody who reads a lot of South African, if I'm in South Africa, I'll read the South African press, and it always strikes you how some South African media, which professes to be very progressive, with often very progressive editors, black editors, some of them, their British copy is stuff they took from the Daily Mail and the Telegraph.
But literally,
Argus does that. The Weekend Star and them. This independent newspapers, they do this. Sunday Independent used to have a section, and this is going to age me, I suppose. I don't know if they had like a second section, which was like the opinion part. They had like one little book page. I think Maureen Isaacson used to do it. I don't know what happened to that. But then all the foreign coverage is like the New York Times, stuff they took from the Wall Street Journal, the Times of London.
Wikipedia. It's a lot of Wikipedia.
If you are gonna say this is an African newspaper, and all you're doing is like the way we are understanding the world is through this other prism. But I think the last quick point, and I want Grieve, and we're hoping Grieve, gonna bring Grieve right now, because that's why people are here, is the thing that the other point that I was trying to make about the own correspondent in the Sunday Times. That's that other story of even how Africans are reporting about other Africans. It's like the way when you take a flight. In order for you to get to Benin from I don't know, there's probably a flight, so I'm going to make up cities. So don't judge me on this, but let's say you want to move from like, I don't know, Cotonou, and you want to fly to Johannesburg. You first have to fly to Paris, and then you fly to Johannesburg. And I think that journalism is like that too now. Like in order for somebody from Togo to make sense of South Africa, they need to read a French newspaper. I think that's also like part of the whole thing. But in any case, we can go on and on.
Yeah,
we have
we should get going with proceedings. Yeah. But before we do, a reminder to everyone: please remember to subscribe on YouTube, follow us on Facebook and Instagram, as well as Twitter, and go to our website, as well as subscribe to our Patreon for all the episodes on our archive, as well as to support our work more generally. So let's bring on Grieve Chelwa, who we're going to be talking to first. Very excited to have Grieve back on. Hopefully you recognize his face. He's been on the program before. Grieve is a contributing editor at Africa as a Country, as well as an inaugural postdoctoral fellow at the Institute on Race and Political Economy at the New School. And he's
we're wearing blue shirts today.
Wearing blue shirts. I wonder why. I don't know why I didn't get the memo, but we'll sort that out later. Grieve, thank you so much for joining us again. I mean, this time it's on a bit of a sad occasion, so maybe a good place to start is just tell us what the mood in Lusaka is like at the moment.
It's thanks Will and Sean for asking me to come back. It's my third time on the show, so I'm really happy. It's always a pleasure to.
He's gonna get a cup for we have to give him like a mug.
Yeah, but you're right, Will. The mood in Lusaka and in Zambia is rather somber. I think we all knew that Mzee was old and he was getting on in age. He just celebrated his 97th birthday in April. So we were all counting down to the big 100, and the news just caught us off guard. He's been in hospital before, and when we were told earlier last week that he had gone into Minor Soko Military Hospital in Lusaka, we thought he would eventually recover and get out. But yeah, the mood is very somber, very, very somber.
Just can you, so for people, I mean, generally people know the broad outlines of his life. He's the first prime minister, then eventually becomes the president. So from 1964 to 1991, he's, as I said, first prime minister, then president. He puts his stamp on kind of Zambian, I would say he shapes what the country we have today. So can you say a little bit about just kind of like, can you capture his life? And I think what's important also is to say something also about him as an anti-colonial figure, because a lot of people don't know like how he got there. That in order for us to understand that this guy becomes really crucial to the liberation struggles in the region, it only makes sense if you also know about him as an anti-colonial figure.
You're right, Sean. So he's really what we call in Zambia the father of Zambia's independence. I think he attended Kwame Nkrumah's very famous conference in the late 50s, the All Africa People's Conference. I forget what it was called. And he was very much influenced by people like Nkrumah, very much influenced by Nkrumah's dictum that Ghana is not really free if the rest of Africa is not free. So he's from that generation. And you're right that he really is a dominant figure on Zambian history, very much beloved, but our appreciation of KK, as we sort of affectionately refer to him, our appreciation of KK has grown with time ever since he left office in 1991. So being influenced by people like Nkrumah, it was not surprising that during his 10 years president, actually to the displeasure of most Zambians today, if you ask them today, they're a little bit, not so happy that he spent a big chunk of his presidency trying to liberate Southern Africa, a big chunk of his presidency on the African scene, not on the global scene, with very little attention paid to domestic issues. But he's from that generation. He's from Nyerere's generation, from Nkrumah's generation, from Silvio Olympio's generation. He's from that generation that really believed in a liberated Africa as a precondition for economic liberation. So basically, that's who Kaunda was.
It's interesting what you said just now, that a lot of Zambians reflecting back on his time in office wished that he focused as much attention and energy inwardly into the country. Could you maybe say what were the challenges that Zambia was facing post-independence that Kaunda had to deal with and that Zambians felt he wasn't dealing with as much as he could have?
So I think Kaunda's presidency has different phases. And I think even he as a person went through different phases. What seems to me to be clear when I sort of reflect upon his life is that this was a leader who was not very shy to change his mind on certain things when the facts changed. So in 1964, when he becomes president, obviously we inherit a country that has high inequalities that are stratified by race. Right, the colonial settlers, the white settlers had a very good life because the colonial government really focused all their resources on that particular class. And then the Zambians were living in abject poverty. So in the first years of his presidency, he's really looking inwards and he's really thinking about developing the country. And actually, interestingly enough, he's relying on broadly capitalist free market ideas to organize the country. And he believes that the free market is what is going to deliver Zambia to the promised land. But very early on, in the first 3, 4, 5 years of his presidency, he realizes that the private capitalist class is not coming to the party. So he changes completely. He immediately realizes this. He doesn't need any more convincing. And then he announces a broad program of nationalization. So the copper mines are nationalized. The dominant sectors of the economy are nationalized and put in Zambian hands. So, and then when this nationalization is underway, our mainstay copper, the price of copper begins like a 30-year decline, right? So this really pushes the economy into a tailspin. At the same time, Kaunda's attention is divided by what's happening in the region. So there's the war of liberation in Mozambique that's going on with Frelimo, and he's supporting Frelimo. There's what's going on in then Southern Rhodesia, which is Zimbabwe, and he's supporting the freedom fighters there. There's what's happening in South Africa, and he's sort of supporting the African National Congress there. Actually, the African National Congress for a long time has its headquarters in Lusaka. I think it was Radio ANC or Radio Free South Africa. I've forgotten what it was called.
Radio Freedom. Radio Freedom.
Yes, it's broadcasting from Lusaka and all these kinds of things. So basically, why does he become involved in this liberation movement? Because the facts change. You can see that the white settlers are not doing what they promised they would do, which was guarantee majority rule. Again, he's a very complicated character. He really believed in a multiracial society. In a very famous speech in 1980, Zimbabwe's independence, he's using the word of tribe. So he's saying, Zimbabweans, you now have the white tribe, the Indian tribe. They're now part of But basically, when those facts change, he immediately also changes his approach, and he begins to focus much more on what's happening outside Zambia. Some might even say maybe things became very difficult, that he needed that distraction of looking outwards. But this is basically who Kaunda was, precisely.
Thank you. I know we, in asking to be on the show, I forgot to say that maybe we should talk about this, but I'm going to bring it up anyway. It's not a zinger, but he was also associated with what the people called humanism. And he was very much, he was a Christian, but not in a way, because I know in Zambia now, there are also, and we've run articles on this, there are politicians, particularly the ruling party, who run on the sort of Christian line. But when it comes to Kaunda, when he spoke about Christianity and when he spoke about humanism, it was something else.
You're right. So he wanted, like many of those leaders from that generation, he wanted the country to be governed by some ideology, right? So Nyerere had his own version of ideology, his version of African socialism. Nkrumah might have had his own version. So Kaunda developed, working with some scholars, developed this idea of humanism, which is really thinking about man and woman at the center of everything, and then also being governed by love. So for him, I think the basic idea of his philosophy, or the national ideology, an ideology about people. Everything should be about people at the center of it. Really, that's basically what it was. And you're right. And his version of Christianity, he was a deeply dedicated Christian, but not in the sort of the contemporary sense, where we see a lot of these contemporary leaders using Christianity as a political tool, political capital. It wasn't like that. Very interesting version of Christianity, but with this very strong ideology of humanism, which puts people at the center of everything. And when you begin to think about that, then many of the things that he does are not surprising, right? I see people in Mozambique are suffering. I cannot stand by and have us Zambians enjoy our freedom and our largesse whilst our comrades next door are suffering. So we're going to expend some of our budget on that. I mean, there are some estimates of the amount of money that was spent on liberation efforts, which are really mind-boggling and often force you to think about a counterfactual. What if? What if, we hadn't worried about the Sean Jacobs of this world? What would Zambia
the picture on the screen, the picture on the screen is him and Jocelyn Nkomo, right, from Zimbabwe. Yes. Yeah, correct. To the left. Yeah,
you're correct.
I mean, it's when you talk about how he was inspired by these very noble ideas, often you think about that generation. I think it's important, as you've been doing, placing him in the context of that generation of leaders which wanted to govern driven by an ideology. I mean, these ideas often unravel at some point because political realities start to have contradictions which force them to unravel. And we know that Kaunda's leadership eventually ends up with a political crises in the 80s, and he's eventually forced out of power. Could you walk us through his final years in power and the events that sort of precipitated him having to step aside?
I think the one criticism, I was listening to an interview by his eldest son the other day, that even Kaunda regrets, is that he stayed too long. So he stayed for 27 years in power. And then towards the end of the 70s, 80s, the economic crisis is rather grave. Now, what causes the economic crisis? Mostly it's external factors, right? So we have declining copper prices, we have increasing oil prices. This is really a phenomenon that afflicts much of the African continent. So really the economic crisis becomes rather grave in the 80s, right? And as the economic crisis is becoming very grave, he himself begins to also show authoritarian tendencies, right? So we're almost in a perpetual state of emergency and that kind of thing. But it's important, Will, to realize that he was not forced out of power, right? He wasn't forced out of power. What happened is he read the mood, repealed a part of our constitution without a referendum. He just read the mood, listened to the people, repealed a part of the constitution that banned multiple political parties, so that allowed the creation of political parties in 1990. And then in 1991 called an election, lost that election overwhelmingly, lost it. I think he only got 25% of the vote. When the ballots came in, he saw the results, addressed the nation and said, look, I think his famous phrase was, you win some, you lose some. Clearly, the Zambian people want something else, right? The Zambian people want a different ideology. They want neoliberalism, so who am I? and he stepped aside. So that's basically how he stepped aside, rather graciously.
Right, and as we know, the next couple of years were quite depressing for Zambians, right? The Chiluba and a string of other leaders, Banda, etc. Was it Mwanawaza, who would turn out all basically not to do good by Zambian people. So right now, we have an election coming up in Zambia. I think it's August 12th. And we know that it's because he just passed away, of course, now you're going to have political leaders claiming his legacy. And we wanted to ask, like, about, you have figures like, Edgar Lungu, who's the current president, Hichilema, who's the opposition leader. Can you say a little bit about how he operates? Because of course he has been out of power since 1991. And of course, he operated at some level as a kind of elder statesman, but at the same time, there's a way, probably like how Nyerere, I think, operates in Tanzania, or Mandela in South Africa, in which you constantly have to, whoever comes after him, you have to live up to that person's, how good they were, or how brilliant they were, or how they kept the nation together, or how, as you said, they weren't they changed their mind when they felt that things weren't working, and when it was time to leave, they left. So even if they stayed on a bit too long, except Mandela, for example, right, who was only there for 5 years, can you say a little bit about kind of how he operates now, and especially with an election coming, because I saw the first people who gets quoted in all the stories about Kaunda's passing in all the big international papers is Lungu, our beloved leader, and so on. Can you say something about just how he operates now? We don't want to get you in trouble with we don't want to out you.
Yeah, that's true. I think it's also very important to understand, I think unlike Nyerere, my sense is that Nyerere and maybe even Mandela were kingmakers after they left office, right? I think Nyerere might have been a kingmaker in Chama cha Mapinduzi, but in Kaunda's case, he leaves office in 91, and then he tries to come back in 1996, by the way. So he's still very much involved in the political scene. Now, the reason why he tries to come back is that the neoliberal policies are clearly wreaking havoc. And at that point, some people begin to hark back for a time before. So people become very nostalgic and say, maybe we should bring the old man back. So for quite a while after leaving office, Kaunda was very much viewed as biased toward his party. It is only in about the 2000s, when it's very clear that this neoliberalism has really wreaked havoc, that you see him becoming much more of a statesman, not so much a kingmaker, but somebody who, like you are saying, somebody who is used by politicians as political capital. So Mwanawasa, for example, in the early 2000s, he calls his government the New Deal government, obviously after FDR, but also many of the policies and basically Mwanawasa's own countenance and the way he runs the affairs of state is almost like harking back to the Kaunda era. So it's only in the 2000s that Kaunda becomes a statesman, even within Zambia. I mean, globally is viewed as a statesman, but even within Zambia is viewed as a statesman, and everybody begins to use him. Every politician who comes later begins to use him to gain political mileage, right? Michael Sata uses him, basically Rupia Banda, who worked with Kaunda very early on, also tries to use them. And now you see Edgar Lungu and Hakainde Hichilema, who, in my reading of Hichilema's ideological inclinations, are pretty much right of center. But even he is claiming sort of...
I think you one time you told me he's a bit like a Ramaphosa.
Yes, I think of Hichilema as Ramaphosa's Zambian twin, right? And then he is basically, you can see, he's also claiming Kaunda, right? So you often ask yourself, what aspects of Kaunda are you claiming? Because I imagine Kaunda in his heyday would say, I don't believe in some of your policy positions. But you see this also on the patriotic front on Edgar Lungu's side. So Edgar Lungu is also trying to use Kaunda's legacy for political capital. Right now, there's a very big debate in the country about how to handle KK's burial and everything around his death, right? So the government wants to take his body across the country, and people think that's a political gimmick. So you can really see him.
This election, yeah.
What is astounding, Sean, also very quickly, what is astounding to me is when I read Facebook posts, Twitter from Zambians, and when I listen to Zambians talk about Kaunda, it's very interesting. I'm very surprised to see just how overwhelmingly the amount of praise they have for the old man. I mean, I'm also shocked by it, because there are a lot of people who are not so happy with his reign, but it's quite interesting and quite wonderful to observe.
Nostalgia is a thing. Go ahead, Will.
No, I mean, I was going to ask a question exactly about nostalgia, which is that, do you think that what Kaunda represents for a lot of Zambians is this time when there was still a sense of political possibility, that Zambia was this, clean slate, and you could really build a political project? You spoke about his humanism, how that became a motive force in Zambian society, and now every subsequent leader has just lacked that kind of political imagination.
I think you're very right, Will. I think when we begin to look back at Kaunda's rule, we look back at his, the clips, the press conferences he gave, his articulations of policy, his articulations of the idea of Zambia. We are amazed just about how clear that articulation was. It might have been wrong in some respects, but he was very clear in his convictions, and he believed in his convictions. I think we are amazed just at how much of an effective leader, both at a domestic level and a global level, that KK was. And then when we compare him to those who've come after, we really are putting our faces in our palms with shame, because those who've come later don't have any ideological conviction, right? We don't even, it's one thing you could have an ideology even if you're wrong and articulate it, right? But the ones who've come later don't have any ideological convictions. They're not statesmen in one way. They're not dignified leader. This is who Kaunda was. He never stole a single cent. When he left State House in 1991, the one thing he was accused of having done was stolen the State House books, the books in the State House library. That's the only thing that he didn't have. I mean, he hardly had a house. I mean, for a long time, we had to rent a house for him, right? He didn't even have a house. A man who ruled for 27 years. Clearly, his energies and minds were on other things and not on personal aggrandizement. This is who he was.
I want to ask the last question. I had an option of for the last question. I was going to ask you the big question, but I can ask you that another time. I was going to ask you about football, because I think people like to show you pictures of Sankara kicking a ball, holding a ball in his hand. I can't think of who else. Zuma in the shorts during the World Cup. But what a lot of people don't know is how much Kenneth Kaunda is associated with football, and you maybe you could just tell that story, a little bit of that little story, because I was telling you before the program, I think it was ironic that somebody who was so associated with Zambia's success with football, and I forgot something which I know you're going to remind me of. I said that it all leads up to 1988 in Seoul, when they beat Italy. When the national team, led by Bwala, by the way, young Kalusha Bwala, they beat Italy of Dino Zoff and them, I think. They beat a really Italian football team that's still going to go to the World Cup, the next World Cup. So that for me is like the high point of Kaunda's football legacy. But you reminded me it was a little earlier. And I also think it's interesting that right after him, then that team, that's the team of '88 is the players who die in the plane accident. And then only, is it 2012, when Zambia finally makes true on the potential of the national team, and they win the African Cup of Nations. But can you just because people say there's too much football on this program, but it doesn't stop us. Can you just quickly, as we see these glorious photos of Kaunda doing some kipi, as people call it, kipi api, some people call it. I like how you call it tap. You are tapping. Kaunda is tapping. Can you just say something about him and football?
I mean, football is life, Sean. So football is life on the African continent. So those naysayers can go watch something else. Football is life over here. So for up until 1991, the national soccer team, they're now known as Chipolo Polo, which is the Copper Bullets. But up until 1991, they were called KK 11, Kenneth Kaunda 11, right? KK loved football. I just saw recently on Facebook a letter that he hand wrote. Well, it was typed but hand signed by him, written in about late 60s, early 70s to the either the chairperson of Leicester Football Club or the manager of Leicester Football Club then,
Wow.
who he had invited to visit Zambia and to help build, soccer football infrastructure in the country. So he really cared about football. Really care about football.
You know why Leicester? Quickly, do you know why Leicester of all?
That would be interesting. That's an interesting question. There's a good friend of mine called Hikawa Chipande has who Sean knows because he did his PhD.
Asked him to write something. We don't want to put more pressure on him on air, but we did ask him to write something about this.
Yeah. I mean, Hikawa Chipande has written a lot about football during the KK days and what it meant, and how possibly KK was maybe using it for political expediency. Maybe Chipande could be right, but I also believe KK just loved football, and he saw football as a mechanism to unite the country, because KK hated ethnicity, hated this idea of, because man and woman at the center, right? We can't have all these sort of things like tribe, race, caste, all these things divide us. So he saw football as one avenue that would unite the country. So he really loved football, supported the football team, and the team was known as KK11 up until 1991.
Grieve, thank you so much for joining us. That is a great note to end. We've got to find out why Leicester Football Club and nag your friend to finish the piece so we can read more about this. But
again, the foresight is the foresight. It's the foresight. He knows that one day, if I'm with them now, I train them.
Yes.
I take care of them. We're gonna win that Premier League.
Yeah, and then I think if I'm not mistaken, one of our biggest stars at the moment, called Patson Daka, signed up for Leicester.
He just did?
I think he just did sign up for Leicester in the last week or two. I have to check that.
Oh, no way. I thought he was a free agent. I was hoping Tottenham could get him, but this is terrible news.
He did. Let's go. We got to go to Herman Wasserman, who's waiting. But you're right.
Okay.
Time for Leicester. There you go. That's the connection. Kaunda,
longevity, vision. They had vision. These leaders, they had vision. Thank you so much, Grieve. We always appreciate you appearing on the show, and we're really excited to welcome our next guest, who's Herman Wasserman, who is a professor of media and film studies at the University of Cape Town, as well as a principal investigator in a global study on disinformation that is being coordinated by the International Development Research Center. And he's also a contributor on Africa is a Country. So, Herman, thank you very much
I want to give Herman his full respect. I want to give Herman his full respect. He's an old friend. He's one of my best friends, and we're not going to treat him nicely because of that. We're going to be combative, go after him, throw some fingers. We want to welcome him to the show.
Hi, Sean. Hi, William.
Thanks for coming on. I mean, there's so much to say on this topic. I suppose I want to start with a big story that broke in South Africa last week. South Africans really excited to hear.
Herman is already smiling at the prospect of this story.
We were also excited to hear that there was a couple in Tembisa, which is a township in Johannesburg, for context, that had birthed 10 children, which would have, if true, broken the Guinness World Record for childbirth. Obviously, this caused a massive social media storm. Everyone was so interested. It was exactly what we all needed right now, just given how COVID is ravaging everyone and everything. And it turned out that it wasn't quite true. So could you just, because we mentioned it on the episode last week, we didn't speak too much about it, but could you maybe just walk us through the story quickly?
Yeah, look, I can give you a very brief summary. It's a long story, but it started when the Pretoria News, Peter Mpedi from the Pretoria News, published a story stating as a fact that this woman has given birth to a dectuplets, I think is the word that we've all learned in the last 2 weeks. It was stated as a fact. There was a fundraising campaign that kicked off, and and as you say, I think this was at a time when people were looking for some good news, and that's the first thing, maybe just as a sort of quick footnote, is to say that this is how false information or disinformation or misinformation, and we can speak a little bit about different definitions, but that's exactly how it takes hold, because people, it works on people's anxieties, people's fears, people's hopes, people's dreams. And in this case, I think, we're in the middle of a devastating third wave of the pandemic. Our economy is, not looking good. There's all sorts of corruption allegations against our health minister that just had to take a leave of absence. And in the midst of all this chaos and uncertainty and anxiety, here's this good story. But rapidly, that story became undone. It became, so people said, okay, but show us the babies. We'd love to see them. And there were conflicting reports from, apparently the Department of Social Development was quoted as saying that they were looking after the babies. Then, the hospitals that were cited in the report denied all knowledge of this. And it just became clear the more and more people were looking for these babies that they didn't exist. But, Peter Mpedi and the Pretoria News just kept on digging, and they are still digging. What they're really digging.
It's a conspiracy, right? They're saying now it's a
conspiracy
by the government.
So now they're claiming they're still refusing to take any accountability. Now that I think the whole country has realized there aren't any babies. It's the Tembisa 0, not the Tembisa 10. And now, hey?
No, it sounded like a football score. Tembisa 0. Good evening. And the scores for tonight: Tembisa 0. Big news.
South Africa 0-2.
But I think the issue here is that, okay, so there are lots of different issues, but so the Pretoria News, Iqbal Survey, who's CEO of independent media, plus Peter Mpedi, they are alleging that this is all a big cover up. Who would cover this up is the obvious question, and why? Why would somebody hide something like that? What also became clear, and I think this is where the story becomes a bit more sad, I think, is that, this is a woman, this is a family, there's all sorts of relationships at stake. A woman that is, clearly a history also of sort of problematic pregnancies and so on. There's the issues around maybe mental health issues. And it's just a very cynical way to deal with somebody's evidently heartbroken and somebody that is at sea in a way at the moment. And there's no good way for the story to play out, I think, neither for the family involved nor for independent media. But independent media has lost almost all its credibility in any case in the last number of years. And we know that Peter Mpedi himself is also a very controversial figure. He was involved with previous journalistic scandals like the so-called Rogue Unit. There was a South African Revenue Service story that it was published in the Sunday Times when he still worked there, alleging that the South African Revenue Service had a so-called rogue unit that was involved in all sorts of underhand doings and corruption, which later on also appeared to be, a big false story. Sunday Times had to retract it. The South African National Editors Forum just launched a massive inquiry into media ethics and credibility as a result of that exact same saga and others. So it's all sort of quite worrying indications about the state of at least journalism at independent media.
But the big question here is, and I hopefully you could break this down. So the question is like, why does he? You just said he seemed to have lost credibility over previous stories. It's very obvious, and I think I saw a story in Sunday World that somebody was sharing around. It's a South African tabloid, and Herman, by the way, has done some really interesting work on tabloid newspapers and their function, their sort of democratic functions in societies. But there is something here about, like you're pointing out that this IOL, which is the one of these the company under which the Pretoria News belongs, has lost a lot of credibility, right? In South African kind of media circles. Similarly, this journalist Peter Mpedi, there's also some issues with his credibility. Yet somehow this stuff persists. So the question becomes, we want to understand, like, why do people believe this kind of, and hopefully you could break this down, like what people call fake news, or what amounts to disinformation. Like, why do these things, why do they stick? Like, why does it seem like for days, even though any person, the first time they heard about the 10 babies, they didn't see the babies, they noticed, you know, you don't have to be a detective or like have a PhD. Some regular people I know were telling me like, there ain't no babies there. But why is it that this stuff sticks? So can you get a little bit for us into the I don't want to call it the sociology of this. Like we want to understand the political, the social conditions that lead to this kind of fake news or disinformation.
Look, I think there's a lot in that question. You know, the one question is just on a very individual psychological level, why do people believe it? And, you know, and Will alluded to this right at the start to say, you know, people are looking for some positive news. And I think that is why people wanted this to be true. There are other reasons why once the story became, you know, you can also say that there's another reason why the story happened or was allowed to happen, and that was the breakdown of editorial standards at Independent, which is maybe a slightly different story, but it is connected to sort of the issue of the media as a whole, you know, that I know is the topic of one of the topics of your program, so we can talk about that as well. But I think in terms of why people persist in believing this, you know, one of the narratives that was pushed on Twitter was hands off Pete Ramperi. Ramperi is black excellence, and notably deflecting or denouncing criticism from other news outlets by saying that's the Tumamina media. So what they're doing is they're inserting this into the bigger narrative of the ANC's internal struggles. Tumamina, you know, is widely associated with, obviously associated with Cyril Ramaphosa, which is sort of his slogan. So the radical economic transformation faction was another. So this also, the way that people wanted to believe or did believe, this also related to where they stand on that narrative of, you know, some of the media are dismissed as Tumamina media, and others are the sort of independent media who proclaim to be doing the work of radical economic transformation, which of course is just a ruse for them to be doing what they want to do. But and that reminds me, maybe reminds some of the viewers of a much earlier example of disinformation, which was slightly different because it was much more orchestrated, and that's the Bell Pottinger scandal, where the whole narrative of radical economic transformation, white monopoly capital, and so on, really originated in South Africa, where that term was weaponized for the first time. So the whole idea of and that's interestingly or importantly, I think that example also was used to discredit critical media. So media that were critical at that time of Jacob Zuma were accused of being, you know, in cahoots with the Rupert's white capital and so on, was a way of undermining the criticism against Zuma, because at that time it was when the public protector, Tuli Madonsela, at that time, her report around state capture first came out. So we see that all these things also, it has a personal, individual psychology behind it, but it also has a broader political and social sort of narrative in which it is embedded and which gives it its traction and gives it and amplifies it.
Especially on this kind of current of disinformation that we're speaking about. What is interesting about a place like South Africa is that the vehicle for disinformation campaigns is the established media. So rather than, for example, trying to create alternative media through social media, I mean, that does happen. But in South Africa, for example, if you distrust critical media, as you were saying just now, you would create your own media avenue. So ANN7 was a TV channel that was affiliated with the Gupta family, which is at the heart of the state capture scandal in South Africa. The New Age was another newspaper that was affiliated with them as well. So they created these new media houses to rival established critical media, but it was still operating in the mainstream.
Right. I think what's interesting about that, and that's a very good observation, I think, and that is that that the mainstream media are still the outlets that set the political agenda to a large extent. You know, although social media, people are quite active on social media. I think the South African sort of Twitter sphere is quite noisy and loud and quite vibrant and often very funny. But I think as far as political capital and social capital is concerned, you know, people still pay attention to what is published in mainstream news outlets. And I think what is also important is that when we look at trust levels, so recent studies that I've been involved with and other people have done internationally, the Reuters Institute, for instance, it shows that people still have fairly high levels of trust in the South African established media. And we saw this in the initial days of the lockdown, for instance, after the pandemic just broke, and people turned. There was a huge uptake in traffic to news websites, for instance, things like News 24 and Mail and Guardian and Daily Maverick and so on. They all showed a spike because that's where people turned when they really wanted to know what is true. So independent media, I think, plays in that space, and that's why it is taken or wants to be taken seriously. If this was just a rumor that played out on Twitter or Facebook, probably nobody would have taken as much heed of it. And that, at the same time, is also why it is so worrying, because it means that they are competing in this sort of so-called legitimate space. If you talk about social capital, they have the social capital of being an established news outlet, yet they don't subscribe, they don't subject themselves to the Press Council, for instance. And the Press Council is the self-regulatory body where if false reports are published like this, if this was the case, say the Sunday Times or Mail and Guardian or some other newspaper published this, you could take them to the Press Council that would adjudicate that this is false and force them to apologize. But the independent media withdrew from that body, so they're absolutely unaccountable to, they're accountable to nobody but themselves, which is, also very worrying in this era where there's so much disinformation floating around. And I mean, this is a long answer. Also, maybe just to come to the question that Sean posed around why people believe this, it takes us into maybe this current pandemic context where there's also a lot of informal sort of networks of communication where people just send around conspiracy theories and rumors and so on social media. And people tend to grasp at straws because they're anxious and they want some reassurance or something that confirms their fears or hopes.
So you've spoken about mainstream media, but there's also another kind of media that is becoming really important. And you and I have written actually about kind of the impact of social apps, messaging apps like WhatsApp.
Yeah.
And the case which a piece we wrote for Africa as a Country Together was actually about violence that happened in Cape Town over housing. It was a housing struggle that quickly sort of dissolved or into kind of the sort of peculiar racial politics of that city. And people started spreading ugly WhatsApp messages and organizing themselves that way, racially kind of instigating kind of racial hatred, if you want, between South African nomenclature, Coloureds and Africans. Can you say something about, because I know there's been work done in India and there's a lot of talk about the impact that WhatsApp had on Indian elections and the rise of the BJP. Do you think, and I want you to also maybe say a little bit more beyond South Africa also, what is your research showing about the role of these social media apps, these instant messaging apps for politics, for social movements, and particularly for elections? So, for how these elections, because inevitably often there's violence that become part of the process. Can you say something about that?
Yeah, right. I mean, we know that WhatsApp is a tremendously popular platform in Africa, and it's growing, and it's so as a social messaging platform that is cheap and free and accessible, it has tremendous reach and popularity. And these sort of networks and mobile phones and so on, in the sort of academic literature, there's sort of one strand that often celebrates that because there's these success stories of how people have mobilized themselves, activists have mobilized themselves, or where people spread the news around repression or whatever the case might be. But the converse is also true, and this is what you're pointing to, is that these platforms also amplify much of the xenophobia and the hate and the polarization that is also endemic in these societies. Incidentally, Sikalo, which is the township that you referred to, there's today again a protest. I haven't sort of studied it, but I just saw headlines that even today there's been a protest around service delivery there. So it continues to be a sort of hotspot of that sort of tension. And I think what that township signifies is that there are all these sort of social tensions, racial tensions that predate all these platforms. But increasingly also xenophobic tensions. In South Africa, we know South Africa has a very bad history of xenophobic clashes and conflicts. I think it's probably going to increase with the run-up to the local elections later this year, because that's certainly an issue that populist politicians will be pushing. And elsewhere on the continent as well, to come back to your question around what happens elsewhere on the continent and internationally, you mentioned India. Hate speech, extreme speech, anti-immigrant narratives, all these things are they find fertile ground on these social media platforms. And that is one way, I think, if you talk about democratic processes and elections, and that's one way in which those sort of processes are undermined or are maybe get a sort of alternative sphere of discourse. But then, of course, you also get more orchestrated campaigns where people are actively using bots and trolls and so on Twitter to meddle with elections and spread false narratives. We've just seen the elections in Ethiopia yesterday, and that tension there in Tigray. There was an example of so-called click-to-tweet pages where people can just go online and they're already pre-written tweets, anti-Tigrayan tweets, and people can just click on it and it tweets it out. So it's almost like harnessing the crowd to do that misinformation. And there's also more sophisticated ways in which this happens, sort of paid sock puppets, people that are paid to do this. There are bots online. So all these sort of things are, I think, forces to reckon with when we talk about elections on the continent. But what I would just note is that they like we saw in the Bell Pottinger example, like we see in this WhatsApp Sikalo example that you mentioned, all of this maps onto pre-existing social and political forces and amplify them and play into those sort of discourses. So there's also sometimes people tend to sort of have a sort of deterministic narrative around social media, saying that social media are causing this. They are. In fact, I think it's just a matter of amplifying, and of course amplifying that hugely and have a huge influence. But the real problem is not obviously the networks. The problem exists and pre-exists in society.
And on that, thinking about the continent again, we also maybe sometimes, do you think we sometimes maybe overestimate the reach and penetration of social media, especially on a continent like South Africa? There's no denying, on a continent like Africa, rather, there's no denying the fact that there's still a massive.
There's going to become a meme
to the logo.
Yeah, it happens, but there's still a massive digital divide insofar as the majority of people can't access stable internet, and that affects their ability to be sort of legible in the public sphere. And there's still a whole swath of people whom aren't engaging or engaging in different ways, and that affects how we understand all of this.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that's a caveat that, especially media scholars that looking at social media always have to, note, is that you are still talking about a very specific demographic, often usually urban, male, all those sort of determinants. But there's also a difference, I think, between something like WhatsApp, which is much more widespread than, say, Twitter and Facebook. So Twitter and Facebook and those social media platforms, I think, are even more limited. But even so, I think there's a lot that happens outside of technology, right? And so I'm part of this group of researchers and activists and NGOs that at the moment work around vaccine hesitancy in South Africa, or rumors and conspiracy theories around it. And so we do what they call social listening. So every week we get together on a Friday, and everybody piles in and tells, okay, I've heard this rumor, I saw this. And what is just really important to note there is that there's a lot happening in the queues at the clinics, so and on the ground and in the streets, that is not captured on social media. And that so if we take social media to be the whole world, obviously we are making a big mistake. Yet I think sometimes it might just be an indication of wider conversations that are happening elsewhere that find their way into WhatsApp. But yeah, we shouldn't equate the two.
I have one last question for you, which is my bugbear, which is in trying to think about an alternative politics, because we're sort of stuck now, it seems, with nationalist parties that rhetorically are committed to change the societies we live in. That they say the ANC, I think, is part of that problem, if you want. And in the absence of then the rest of these sort of sectarian parties or reactionary parties, so EFF is an example of one, and then reactionary parties like the DA or the Freedom Front, and then you have, like, as we were saying at the beginning of the program, we have media that seem to align or line up very well with those political organizations, and as a result, it limits what is politically possible in places like South Africa, Kenya, or Ethiopia. And because I know the case you know best is South Africa, and you and I invested in that country, so is Will. Is there anything useful? And I know you say you don't want to be like, what's it called, media-centric or media-deterministic or whatever, that people can take, if you want, let's be blunt, that a left can take from how we could think about, because you've done a lot of work now on social media and its interaction with politics. Is there anything, and I'll do one other plug for you, because I'm trying to blow you up here so you can give us the right answer. You've also you've done some studies on the Treatment Action Campaign, when that was the pioneer stage of this use of social media in politics. Where do you see social media coming in, maybe to mess with the politics of South Africa, so that that we can begin to think of other political possibilities than the ones we are stuck with now, whether it's the ruling party or the kind of politics represented by the opposition and so on? Where can social media make a difference?
Yeah, that's a difficult question, because I sometimes wonder, if you look at the way that, just to come back, do a full circle back to this Tembisa story. I mean, if you look at the way that people responded to this and responded to criticism of the story, often people don't even read, what you write, or they didn't even bother to, it's just like this firing from the hip, shooting from the hip. And we've seen politicians, doing the same. We know that Helen Zille, for instance, is notorious for shooting from the hip on Twitter. Other politicians, Herman Wasserman himself, is also, fond of that sort of social media. I think that we have maybe... Sorry, you're muted, Sean.
I'm muted. I was going to say, we should explain for non-South African viewers, Helen Zille is the former leader of the opposition party, but she's still powerful. She writes books. She's a bit like a sort of, who's the Catholic representative from Santorum? She's like Rick Santorum from Pennsylvania. Like, she's a character like that. She's still around.
On social media, fighting the culture wars, bemoaning the rise of identity
culture
politics.
War, cultural
Yes, you've got it.
And then Herman Wasserman, for people who don't know, he was a kind of
Rudy Giuliani, South African
Rudy Giuliani, or Herman Cain, or Herman Wasserman made his money from selling people hair products, and Black Like Me, I think it was called, and he fashioned himself into a crusader against corruption and became the mayor of Johannesburg on the ticket of the Democratic Alliance, and he's quite xenophobic. So just for the purposes,
and he's, by the way, I mean, quick point on Herman, which is very interesting. He's starting like his new political party.
It's not this Herman, by the way, but continue.
Yeah, on Mashaba, yeah. Just a quick point on him is that the new political party that he's formed is going to give sort of voters the opportunity to directly select who they want to run for elections, which is pretty much like how, you know, the 5-star movement in Italy and Beppe Grillo formed, which is about this idea you use social media to create this like direct access between political representative and citizen, and you cut all mediation. So
and the platforms
directly taken social media.
And by the way, the platforms are almost the same. It's a kind of a populism that says that the political system has failed, that the political class is corrupt, and it also heavily on xenophobia. So the real blame for everything are the foreigners and the immigrants. So he's, you know, it's the same. It's almost like using the same playbook. Yeah. Right. But sorry, Herman, we tried doing.
No. So I've been thinking about your question. I think the question that you can slice it two ways. You can ask what is the role of social media in politics, and I think for me that is a question in terms of it's a very noisy place. You're probably only going to speak to your own constituency. You're probably only going to amplify. You know, we know those things about filter bubbles. People, people's biases and positions are only hardened, not really changed. So I'm not that optimistic that social media is going to change like voting behavior. Really, I think where social media can play a big role is supporting the real politics. And if you talk about the politics of the left, I don't think, to use the old famous line, the revolution is not going to be tweeted, right? So, I mean, the real politics is not going to happen there. The real politics will happen in, mobilization, activism, social movements, people sort of doing real sort of politics on the ground. Similarly, I think a lot of what we've seen that moved what's the American term? Moved the dial, or the
Overton window, I think, is the American term.
Well, what we've seen in the last few years, things that really had an impact is, for instance, the state capture allegations, and that was done by investigative journalism. So good old-fashioned, old-school journalism that dug up and collaboratively, also not competing with each other, but different teams of journalists digging up that dirt that now can be used by the prosecution, and by very slowly and too slowly, but the institutions, the democratic institutions, can use that. So I think if you talk about where's the real power and the energy and the dynamism is in those places. I mean, it's in real good journalism, activism, politics, movements, social movements on the street. And then social media can serve those purposes by maybe amplifying investigative journalism, or by helping people mobilize protest, or connecting different groups of activists, that sort of thing. So I think their social media and messaging platforms have a real political potential, but I don't think it is going to have a big. I think it's such a noisy, such a polarized sphere that I don't think it's going to change people's minds any day soon.
As long as I've known Herman, I've never suspected that he was I always suspected that he was, deep down, he was an old school Marxist. Because when it came down to it, I wanted Herman to say, it's on the internet. It's the tweaks that are going to get us free. And he said, no, it's like old school mobilization.
Organizing. It's good, organizing. Classic organizing.
I am old, I hardly know where this is from computer.
He was like, I went for it, and I was like, okay, I'm okay with Herman. He's on the right side.
Yeah. If you ask my son, he'll say TikTok. So I mean, that's we haven't even spoken about TikTok. When TikTok,
I don't understand it.
Just a very quick note. I mean, if you look at again, it's maybe not quite technically disinformation; it's more propaganda. But for instance, the way that I just saw yesterday, one of my students showed me the Israeli Defense Force (IDF), right? How they're using TikTok to glamorize Israeli soldiers, right? So and they what they call thirst traps, these attractive women soldiers just posing, with a gun. That is part of the sort of image engineering, the soft power, PR, and it certainly I'm not dismissing that is not influential and important to look at. Absolutely not. But I think if you ultimately, if you talk about a sort of a left politics, I think
those things are designed. They also designed. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Will. Go ahead.
I was just going to say what's interesting about the example Herman just gave is that during the most recent escalation of violence, a lot of Palestinian activists and people in Gaza and the West Bank and East Jerusalem were using Snapchat and its sort of location tagging feature, I think, to sort of show the reality of the bombardment and the devastation it was causing, and using that to contrast how in Israel pretty much normality reigned. So it's interesting that these two platforms are, as we've been discussing, different sites of information warfare.
And I know you want to finish with maybe one last quick point.
Go ahead.
Just to say that I think, we have to think about these things as intermeshed. I'm not putting one, so the streets and the activism there, and so, because we've seen that happens on the right, but we've also seen it on the left. And maybe one good example here is the Black Lives Matter movement. I mean, so the most recent Black Lives Matter movement that gained energy in the US, was as a result of somebody actually filming police brutality on their cell phone, and that went viral. And then didn't stop there. Then people started marching and people stood up, and then there was the real politics that happened. The one would probably not be possible without the other, I think. So, and I think we have to increasingly think about these things as interlocked and intermeshed.
But there's also something built into the app, the business model of the app. The kind of, so you're right. The IDF kind of, in a way, almost exploits the logic of it, which is thirst traps, or as the mouthing of like a song, like for a quick 2 minutes or whatever. But the point I was going to make about what I find frustrating about social media, and I have teenagers, I have a teenager and a tween, and what I find fascinating is like how the controversies, or what is considered politics, is very fleeting. It's like it blows up not over something often that is of actual political consequence. It's like somebody said something, and this is now the big thing. Twitter does, I think, some of that too. And then everybody spends an enormous amount of time. We're not going to discuss that now because it's a fish of its own kind. But there is the current debate, the current back and forth between Chimamanda Adichie and Emeze, which basically, when it came down to it, it was personal betrayal. I invited you to my house. Now you're dissing me, and it's about who promoting books, promoting sales. But that dominated the politics for at least a day and a half. Like African Twitter, African social media, everybody was telling you about it. And at that very same time, you had there were bigger stories around the questions of sexual minority rights, sexual oppression. Like in Ghana, the police, I think, had arrested something like almost 30 people for just turning up for a workshop about LGBTQ rights. So it's what takes up all the space that I have a problem also with social media, and what is like I'm not saying what is real and what's not real, but what is often something of
what is consequential,
But somebody's life is on the line, and we have sort of often people who are already empowered fighting on the internet, and we're all kind of joining in and piling on, and when it's over, well, then we move on to the next. Like I can go look into what's trending right now and find there's going to be another one, but in the interim, the same inequalities gets reproduced and nothing gets done about that. And we didn't have a chance to organize on that because we're obsessed with, I don't know, somebody said something to somebody. And that's
well, to be fair, that's true of mainstream media as well. I mean, the mainstream newspapers would also cover a conflict when it's spectacular. And we know that from back to the example of Sikalo and activism. When people burn tires in the street and blockade the streets so people can't get to work, then they'll report on it. Tomorrow, when the road is cleared, the problems didn't go away, but the media is gone. So I mean,
right. The real issue there was housing.
Then rugby or whatever is on the front page.
Yeah.
Well, then it's like, who's in the Springbok team or something?
Yeah.
But it's like, I mean, in that case, it was a situation of like, this was a struggle. This was the city that had supplied people with land, well, had allowed them to squat there and not supplied them with any services. So it had created a housing crisis, which the people across the road was perceiving in a certain kind of way. And then the city sort of just stood back while these two sets of people are fighting. You know, and all the rhetoric and all the frustrations that people have with life under the new conditions sort of blow over. But in any case, we could go on and on. It's always wonderful. Herman, you know, you and I we talk a lot. So it's for me, it's great to finally have you on the program, to have an old friend.
Great. No, thanks.
We're old friends now. We're old. To have you on the program.
You guys aren't that old. You guys aren't that old. I'll say
We like to say we're old.
certified youngster.
I think I'm getting old. I was throwing like a baseball with my son yesterday, and it was just throwing ball, and I was like, "Yo, I got old. I'm not. I used to be like good with the feet. Maybe I'm not Maradona. I think I'm more like, I don't know, somebody who plays for what's it, Polokwane City. No, actually, those are real professionals. Calm down. But it's like I
hope
literally
you're watching and listening to this.
I'm slow.
Yeah, they can control you.
So anyway, it's always great having you. Earlier we had Grieve Chelwa. Thanks to Grieve for coming on again. Herman Wasserman for being our guest. My co-host Will Shoki, our producer Antoinette Engel. We want to say enjoy the week, everybody, and we'll see you next week. Hopefully.
Make this episode go viral. If there's anything you make go viral, let it be this episode.
Go viral. There you go.